You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Our October 2025 roundtable hosted Damien Cregeau, author of Portraits of Patriots, Colonel John Trumbull and 5 fellow patriots from Connecticut in the American Revolution. Our discussion took place on Zoom. Please enjoy our roundtable discussion with Damien Cregeau. All right, so we're here tonight at the American Revolution Roundtable, and we're met with Damien Cregeau, who's written Portraits of Patriots, which is a book I found very fascinating because it doesn't just cover the people that we've read about a million times in the American Revolution, but looks at some of the key figures of Connecticut's Revolution experience. Damien, welcome to the podcast, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me on. You know, as I was saying to you before we went live, I've been a big fan of your podcast for years. I remember starting with the French and Indian War into all the way through to 1774, and I thought, wow, this guy is really dedicated. You know, the kind of person that I am. You know, we like going down the wormholes. And when COVID broke out in 2020, I thought I can make lemonade out of lemons. You know, if God closes one door, maybe another one does open indeed. And we had already made an appointment. And this is basically, you know, not far from where you grew up in the Philly region. We had already had a reservation, my wife and I, for me to meet at the Pennsylvania Historical Society in downtown Philly, for me to take the 2 Gaylord archival boxes out of storage, you know, in the vault, and look at the papers of a little known U.S. Navy frigate called the USS Confederacy. And of course, people say, oh, the Confederacy, is that Civil War? No, it's the American Revolution. It's probably Congress saying under the, you know, presidency at that point of Samuel Huntington of Norwich, Connecticut, where I'm staying across the street. You know, my house is across the street from his. So I'm here at the home that my wife and I own, General Jedediah Huntington's house. And President and Governor Samuel Huntington's house is across the street. I should also mention a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So anyway, to get back to the answering your question, I had a reservation or appointment to meet at the Pennsylvania Historical Society on the ominous date of Friday the 13th of 2020. So I guess we're getting into Halloween season, so everyone can ooh and ah about the vibes of, you know, how ominous it was to be there on that fateful day, because that was the last day that probably somebody like me could get into the museum, not knowing that we were going to shut down completely Monday and Tuesday across the United States. You know, we'd already seen what had happened in Europe and the Middle East. And so we got in and I went through the papers and then came back home. Well, Sunday we were at Valley Forge. And, you know, we'll get into that later in this video discussion, but it was really weird to be there Sunday the 15th at the mecca of where our Patriot soldiers suffered the most from disease, right? Yeah. And that's Sunday the 15th. And then Monday, everything starts to shut down. So that opened up a door of opportunity for me to make, like I said, lemonade out of lemons and go down a very long rabbit hole called, let's take the second tier folks from Connecticut and talk about their support to George Washington's efforts. I grew up near Benjamin Talmadge's house, and I already knew the story of David Humphreys, and I thought, okay, I could talk about them, but they've already been written about a little bit. The first people I want to talk about, much to my surprise, are ones whose biographies have never really been written. Jedediah Huntington, Ebenezer Huntington, Jedediah's wife, Faith Trumbull Huntington, who, you know, we'll get into all of these, and then Samuel Webb of Wethersfield. I thought, no one's really written biographies of these individuals. And I thought, you know, this, if you look at, I say this in some of the longer blurbs, when you look at the American Revolution books, what's out there historiographically? It's either a biography of Washington, Arnold, or someone else of that fame, or it's a battle study, or it's a complete study of the American Revolution from beginning to end. I thought, let me do something different. Let me analyze 4 or 5, and it turned out to be 6 different people and their contributions who were second tier. They're not the most famous people, and yet they're not Joseph Plum Martin, who had already, told us great stories, or some of the other great memoirs and diaries of foot soldiers. So I felt like I was filling a gap in the literature from a scholarly perspective that was readable for the general reader as well.
And these people were, even if they weren't the key players in a lot of things, they were in a lot of interesting places. John Trumbull was an aide to Washington, and his other, I guess there were two brothers, John Trumbull and Jonathan Trumbull, and they were both aides to Washington's at different time during the war. Huntington was mostly with Israel Putnam during most of the war. Is that right?
So I'll handle the Trumbull part of it first. What I love is that John Trumbull serves a mere 19 days for General Washington as aide. And guess what age he is? 19. So he serves 19 days as a 19-year-old. What do 19-year-olds do? They move on to something else, right? They don't have that discipline and attention span. And then Jonathan, his brother, as you point out, his older brother, is going to serve as military secretary during the Yorktown campaign. Whereas the Huntingtons, Ebenezer and Jedediah, the two half brothers, same father, different mothers, because the first mom died, Jedediah's biological mother died. Jedediah will serve as a colonel in charge of a regiment, and then he becomes a brigade commander as a result of the Battle of Ridgefield. Whereas Ebenezer, his younger half brother, is serving in various capacities. Ebenezer is serving as a captain in that particular militia regiment, but he is going to eventually wind up helping Samuel Webb in his regiment, especially at the Rhode Island campaign in August of 1778. And then his most, famous letters are from Jockey Hollow in that fateful winter of, 1780 and 81, I think. But the letters kind of read like Benedict Arnold. He's really upset at Congress and the Continental Army as well as the Americans in general.
Well, everybody was at that point. That's when they were having all the mutinies and all that.
Good point. Yep.
You get a real feel for the army. The soldiers really, I think, felt a sense of betrayal, especially in the latter part of the war, where they were literally starving and in rags, and civilians around them were actually doing pretty well at that point. The economy was kind of getting back on its feet, and people were fine, and they were just basically starving to death, and they felt like the country had abandoned them while they were out in the field still.
Yes. Yes. Now I'll say that you're alluding to what is the scope of my book? It cuts off at 1779,
Yeah.
this first book, because the good problem I had on my hands is, like you, I was diving in depth into these narratives. I found just a wealth of information, so that, like you say, they're not always at the most famous battles or playing the most important roles at them. Jedediah Huntington is not a borderline reckless, brave battlefield leader from the front like Benedict Arnold or Marquis de Lafayette, and yet he's at several important battles, or what would have been battles. White Marsh, for example, an esoteric would have been battle outside of Philly, as you know, but he's at Monmouth, he's at the Siege of Boston, he's in the New York campaign. But I felt it was important to talk about these people, and I realized around September of 23, when I was talking with author Nathaniel Philbrick on the phone, he had a good question, which was, how many words do you have? And I said, Dad, I haven't counted them all. So I went back and I counted, because I hadn't hit show word count on each of my chapters in my documents. And sure enough, I had a whopping 200,000 words. So I immediately realized I had this great problem on my hands. Okay, let's see what my ghost editor, who I'll acknowledge is my wife Pam, published in Psychology. What does she say? Is this something you're worth reading, or do you want to sort of cut out some of this stuff because it's a little too boring? She said, no, this is not overly detailed or boring. Leave it all in. I find this interesting. I think other folks who are not specialists in the American Revolution will find it interesting. I said, okay, great. Well, then I need to cut this book in half. So I cut it off at 1779. Not only is that roughly halfway through the American Revolution, but also in terms of my word count as of September 23, it was about halfway, around 100,000 words or 300 pages.
And that is, 79, I guess, is by that time, the war in the North is pretty much over.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. Things had gotten a little quiet, and obviously at that point. And the other part was that when I was talking about the Navy subplot, I learned this from Nat and other authors who were quite successful. when you're talking about the land operations or the American Revolution, it's nice if you can acknowledge the Continental Army as well as privateering in some way. It's always overshadowed because we can't get in some cruise ship or on a yacht and sail out, 50 to 300 miles off the shore and say, oh, well, here's the spot where, John Paul Jones or, Joseph Barry or whoever, performed their naval action. And so we don't have monuments unless they're on shore. So I thought, well, it's important, like these others realize, to talk about the naval contribution. And that's what I do at the end of this book in the last chapter, is begin the first of several chapters at the end talking about the design and building of this unique frigate. And then I cut that as a sort of cliffhanger at the very end of the book to say, okay, as the ship heads out to sea, where is its, what is its destination? Where is it headed? And it leaves the reader wondering, as Seth Harding has taken the helm and this beautiful brand new ship has been built, that basically was, as I've talked to naval historians who teach at the War College in Newport, it was designed to impress the French, because we had already officially signed, the alliance, and they had already been involved in '78 in the Newport campaign, not successfully. But the idea was, could we deliver a ship that was a high performance and yet beautiful ship like the Confederacy? And Connecticut should be proud of that. It's not a famous ship like the Constitution or even other American Revolution ships like the Alfred or others, or of course anything that's sailed by John Paul Jones. But it sheds a light on New England's contributions, right? And so that was one of the goals of my writing this book.
The people who you write about primarily are, as we say, second tier, but they're not enlisted people either, like Joseph Plum Martin. Trumbull and I guess Huntington is the son-in-law of the governor, John Trumbull Sr., and of course John and Jonathan Trumbull are his actual children. So these are people from rather prominent families within the colonies, and nevertheless see the need to go to war and support the Patriot cause, which we sometimes think of. The richer people in various parts of the colonies tend to be Tories, and the others, maybe that live out in the West a little bit, tend to be the ones who end up supporting the Patriot cause overall. And Jonathan Trumbull, the governor, senior, was, I think, the only colonial governor to remain in power from the colonial era into independence. So he made that transition much more smoothly than all the other governors did. And I guess part of that was that he was elected, so he had to have kind of be in touch with the people at all times, unlike appointed governors who were appointed by the crown and were more focused on what thoughts were in London rather than the thoughts of the local constituents.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you find was the interest of these people in going to war and being a part of the war? And, as you say, Jonathan Trumbull, the son, was only a aide to Washington for 19 days before he struck out and started doing other things in the war. Were they trying to kind of find a place for themselves in contributing to the effort, or?
Well, I think it's a few things. One of it's familial, which is that, as you pointed out, the Huntingtons were the in-laws to Governor Trumbull, as you mentioned, the only colonial governor who then serves throughout the American Revolution on the Patriots side and then maintains his governor status after we've won our independence in 1783. And so he's unique. So the Huntingtons, I think, because of the kinship through Jedediah's wife, Faith Trumbull Huntington, who we can get into with kind of a women's history perspective, if you like, they were interested for that reason. There's a family motive, but also the fact that the Huntingtons, in this case, we're talking about Jedediah, the oldest son, being the primary son and wealthiest merchant of 3 generations of prominent merchants in Eastern Connecticut. Joshua Huntington, who had died in 1745 in his 40s, he died of yellow fever in New York City. He was a wealthy merchant who was trading between Norwich, Connecticut, the Norwich. If you envision Norwich and the Thames River as a miniature of Pittsburgh and the 3 rivers, because we have the Shetucket and the Antic forming into a third river called the Thames. And we pronounce it the Old English way instead of the way King George I did, which is Thames. And so hence the English, having to mispronounce it to honor their king, who hardly spoke a word of English in the 1730s and 40s. So it
Yeah.
changed evolved from Thames to Thames. So we pronounce it Thames here in Eastern Connecticut. And they were trading with the Caribbean. So whether it was livestock and other farming goods and produce from interior Eastern Connecticut in towns like where the Huntingtons and Trumbulls lived, Norwich, Lebanon, Franklin, and other towns, you had the same thing going on with towns like Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford up the Connecticut River with what we consider the river gods, and then trading that down into the Caribbean region for things like molasses and rum to bring back north. Wethersfield, for example, since I include Samuel Webb in this story, it was the red onions of Wethersfield that were sent as a source of vitamin C down to the Caribbean for the enslaved peoples who were suffering tremendously down there. And the sugar cane was, of course, coming northbound along with other goods. And I think also we had horses coming out of Connecticut as well. So that was a motivational factor. It's a little bit like George Washington, the wealthy merchants who realized that the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts and so forth, and the actions, the radical, strong actions, the strong-handed actions that the British government, including eventually King George, supporting Parliament, had taken 1765, 1770, 1775. And I'll also add this analysis to help wrap up answering your question. Jedediah Huntington had gone to Harvard. He graduated in 1763. So he knew Boston region really well. He had kept in touch. He had finished second in his class in 1763. So he probably felt this kinship to fellow Bostonians. And it's probably the reason why hundreds of sheep were sent in 1774, as I recall off the top of my head, to Boston, and both Samuel Adams and I think it was John Hancock, one of the other prominent founding fathers of that era, said thanks to the Committee of Safety, or one of his organizations, in order to say thank you for sending all these sheep and other foodstuffs, because we're under the control of the British. It's Occupy Boston, and we have no way to feed ourselves. We're starving. So thank you, citizens of Norwich.
Right. That was when the British had closed Boston Harbor as part of the Intolerable Acts in response to the Tea Party. So, yeah, there was no way for Bostonians to import food, which they had normally just brought in by ship and no longer could. So that's why Connecticut stepped up. I believe Huntington was one of the early Connecticut people to head up to the siege of Boston shortly after Lexington and Concord. Is that right?
Right. So after the events of, so-called Patriots Day, April 1975, he will receive notice from Israel Bissell, the writer who's not nearly as famous as Paul Revere, but deserves some recognition for the distance that he rode from the Boston region through Worcester region down into Eastern Connecticut and perhaps beyond New Haven all the way as far as Philadelphia. And he brings word to Israel Putnam first up in northeastern Connecticut, and then Jedediah Huntington, John Durkee, and Christopher Leffingwell and Governor Trumbull here in the Norwich, Lebanon region to say the British have, the regulars, we should specify, the regulars have come out to Lexington and Concord and engaged Captain Isaac Davis and others in these two actions. So we need to respond, take up arms. And Huntington had been promoted to colonel of the militia here in the Norwich area. And so he brought his contingent up to Boston. Durkee will wind up being actually at the Battle of Bunker Hill that summer. Jedediah is not, because he's dealing with other issues, including his wife's depression. But when you look at the muster roll records and other documents from the spring of 75, most of Huntington's regiment had gotten word by 9 days in that they could turn around and go home to their families to deal with basically the planting season of that spring, April of 75. And those who weren't engaged in farming or other agricultural pursuits stayed with Jedediah to help build earthworks, I believe in Roxbury. And then Jedediah will eventually come home to deal with his depressed wife, whereas Durkee will stay and others with his regiment and perform with heroism at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Right. I think Huntington came back shortly after Bunker Hill. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the day after. I tell people when I give presentations on my book at book signing events, it's a little bit like when you look at Gone with the Wind and you visualize that scene of the actress looking out at this huge crowd, and the camera pans out and you see this huge sprawl of soldiers who are wounded and many of them dying of their battlefield wounds. My mom was a Navy nurse, so that scene always meant something to me. It was poignant. And unfortunately, Faith, who was the governor's daughter, Faith Trumbull Huntington, John Trumbull, the painter's older sister by 9 years, she'd already been suffering from chronic depression. And she writes about this in her letters to her husband, Jedediah. They had been married here at this house when it was brand new as a wedding gift. They were both 23 years old in the spring of 1766. And here it is 9 years later, the spring into the summer of 75. And she's expressing to Jedediah that she's suffering from all these challenging negative thoughts, dark thoughts. She's strong in her Christian faith, but she's feeling a deep depression. So he decides, along with consulting with her dad, the governor, the best thing is to bring her up to Dedham, Mass, to seek treatment with Harvard-trained doctors, which they do. They bring her, but the problem is she shows up in the Boston area the day after Bunker Hill. None of the Trumbull or Huntington families were directly engaged at the battle, but she had wanted to visit her favorite younger brother, John Trumbull, who becomes, of course, the famous painter. And he recounts this in his memoirs from the 1830s. He says, "My favorite sister, Faith, God bless her, the poor thing, it sent her into an even deeper depression just from wrong time, wrong place, to be in the Bunker Hill region the day after that battle." More dark letters, more negativity, more depression. Thanksgiving rolls around in 1775, and the spoiler alert for those who haven't read the second or third chapter of my book is that she decides that when George Washington says no American officers can take leave to return to their families for Thanksgiving dinner and services because rumors are that the British are going to break out of Boston and launch a surprise attack, she immediately is triggered, as we would say in contemporary terminology, and she's extremely distraught about the safety and well-being of her brother John, her brother Jonathan, her brother Joseph, and her husband Jedediah. And she unfortunately takes a rope and hangs herself at this house, either in the house or in the barn behind the house in Dedham, Mass. House still stands, barn is long gone. She hangs herself and dies. And we know the details of this funeral from the diary of Lieutenant Jabez Fitch. Without Jabez Fitch, we wouldn't know some of the specifics because there aren't enough Huntington letters to show the specifics. But it was obviously a somber, powerful occasion. And as far as I know, Jedediah Huntington was the only general besides Israel Putnam to lose his wife in the American Revolution.
And they had a young child, I guess, which he had to pass off to to the child's grandparents because he continued on with his duties in the war.
Right. I'll just mention before I answer your question and get into the young son's wife, one of the things I had to make sure to include in the beginning of my book was a family tree. So I worked with my graphic designer out of New Jersey, and I said to Gordon Bond is his name. I said, we need to create a family tree because every reader who first encounters the Trumbull and Huntington families, as you know, can be easily confused by Governor Jonathan Trumbull Sr., Jonathan Trumbull Jr., his namesake, who will also become governor years later, and then younger brother John. So you have Jonathan Sr., Jonathan Jr., and John. I mean, oh my goodness. And then you have all the Huntingtons and who married who. So we created a family tree. So I wanted to make sure that people had that clarity. Remind me again the question you just had.
I was just saying that he continued on with the war and left his grandson to be raised by.
Oh, yes, Jabez. So I wanted to show the relationship that Jabez had as well. So yes, as you point out, he goes and lives with his grandparents, Faith's parents, mom and dad, the governor and Faith's namesake, Faith Robinson Trumbull. It just so happens that the Connecticut DAR has that as one of their two key museum houses here in Connecticut. And it's marked by the National Park Service and the DAR as the birthplace of John Trumbull. Young Jabez, the nephew of John Trumbull, will grow up in that house after he leaves this house at age 7. He's there by age 8. And it's because he's attending the Tisdale School. Grandfather Jonathan Trumbull, the governor, feels it's important for him to get the best education possible. And Jedediah agrees. And he's obviously going through his grief as a widower, but also he's working for George Washington and managing his regiment. So Tisdale School was perfect. It was a top prep school at its time in East Central Connecticut, a wonderful place. And obviously, Jabez must have been a talented, young, precocious child like a Mozart without the piano skills, because he graduates from Yale before the revolution is over. He graduates from Yale at 15 in 1782.
Hmm.
And then later in life, during the war, he's painted by his uncle Jack, as they say in the family, John Trumbull, and that's at Yale in storage, that little portrait, which I include in my book. But then in his 30s, he's painted by Ralph Earl, another prominent painter from New England, the one who painted Betsy Schuyler Hamilton while he was in debtor's prison. Same painter, Ralph Earl.
And of course, John Trumbull, the painter, left the war fairly early on and moved to England during the war to study with Benjamin West. Is that right?
Right. So he kind of goes back and forth. What's really interesting, it's a confusing scene. So that's another reason why I had to have a timeline and make sure that I sort of highlight the turning points, each transition point that John Trumbull took with his vacillating between his military interests in serving Washington and others, and then pursuing his professional painting career. At that point, I don't think he was sure that he could be a professional painter, because his father, when he went to his dad, the famous quote, dad, he goes to his father and says, "Sir, I want you to know I plan to be a painter. I want to be a professional artist." And the famous response by Jonathan Trumbull Sr. is, "Son, Connecticut is not Athens." Well, Jonathan proved him wrong, because while Connecticut may not be Athens, Yale became quite the repository of art and culture and higher learning. And that's where John Trumbull's nexus of his collection is maintained. And that was an agreement that he had with Yale in the 1830s. And John, to get back to answering your question, he'll be in the acting role of aide de camp to John Sullivan of New Hampshire for the Rhode Island campaign in August of 78. I talk about that towards the end of my book, this first of 2 books. And then in my second book, which I've already written because I had those 200,000 words I mentioned earlier, he will, of course, go off and, as you say, study under Benjamin West. And who's with him? Who's his roommate? Gilbert Stuart.
Yeah, I always found that stunning that an officer in the Continental Army would just travel to England in the middle of the war and not expect there to be any repercussions, which of course you found out there were. But
right. And as you know, there's the British arresting him on suspicion that he was spying for the Patriot cause while as a student painter. And they were using this partly as a response to the arrest of Major John Andre, who we know was also a talented artist, couldn't live long enough to fully blossom into the professional painter or artist he could have become. But we know him as the person who had worked with Benedict Arnold as the go-between between Sir Henry Clinton and Benedict Arnold, the traitor.
And of course, Trumbull is also famous for painting several portraits of George Washington and the famous signing of the Declaration of Independence and a number of other really iconic paintings from the Revolutionary War. That's, he's one of the people who's really painted some of the most iconic images that we think about when we think about the Revolution.
Which, of course, I talk more about in my second book. But in the first book,
Right.
whether you know where John Trumbull is going and will take it to a national stage and become the most famous person of the 6 people I talk about, he's paying homage to his older sister, Faith, who had taken her own life. And yet he says in his memoirs in the 1830s, had it not been for my older sister and her talents as an artist, I never would have thought of pursuing the visual arts myself. What a beautiful thing, and how poignant, that the first female casualty of war would be his older sister. And the fact that her fear of all of them possibly being wounded or killed in battle, none of that would occur. None of them were killed in battle. Now, the other interesting story that involves Faith and her brother, John, is he's a little kid and they're roughhousing. You can think Brady Bunch or some other kind of, show that we grew up on. And the two girls, it's Faith and her sister Mary, I believe, and John in the roughhousing. He mentions in his memoirs how he fell down the back staircase. Why is this important? Because he lost his vision in one of his eyes. And he didn't know that until he was squinting. And he realized, oh my goodness, I can't see out of one of my eyes. I'm blind in one eye. Well, what an amazing story to be able to share with people of all ages, whether they're the parents of young children or they had a traumatic incident when they were young. They can realize you have the possibility to overcome your challenges as a child and do something big, create a legacy, even in the very thing that you found most challenging, like your eyesight. It's like Beethoven going deaf and continuing to write symphonies. It's incredible.
It sounds like you've already written part two of this volume. Is that going to be coming out anytime soon? Do you have a schedule for when you're going to release the second part of this book?
Well, the timing of it, so the two-parter, if I go back to why did I release it in June of 25? Well, the two important reasons were the 250th anniversary of Bunker Hill,
Mm-hmm.
in which one of my key characters, Samuel Webb of Wesfield, who we haven't really discussed much yet, and that's fine, he's at Bunker Hill. I wanted to pay homage, respects to the fact that, recognize it was the 250th Bunker Hill, but it was also, as you know, the 250th birthday for the creation of the U.S. Army by Congress. I felt that it would probably be good for me to let this marinate for a couple of years. And so I'm going through and editing my second book now, and that'll probably come out sometime in 2027 or 28, because we'll be, as you know, commemorating the 250th of the revolution. It's not just next year. It takes us not only to 2033 with the Treaty of Paris, but as you're covering your podcast, it goes beyond with things like the Constitution and the federal era too, the
Sure.
legacy, the evolution of the rights of individuals.
Yeah, I discussed Samuel Webb. At least mentioned him in passing in my podcast a few times, but
Mm-hmm.
he's an interesting character as well from his participation in Bunker Hill and trying to remember what he did after that. I guess he was involved in some of the stuff in Connecticut during the British occupation of New York, right?
Yes. So there's a few things. He's initially, after Bunker Hill, he'll serve for a short time as aide de camp to Israel Putnam. So a legendary figure in more ways than one. And then, as you're alluding to, he is serving under George Washington. He has just arrived as aide de camp, as one of the aides de camp. I think there were five at that point, maybe for General Washington in the summer of 76. He keeps a diary at that point because his stepfather, Silas Deane, the controversial diplomat, had said, hey, stepson, make sure you keep a diary. And that was wise advice by Silas Deane. Now, Sam didn't always comply when things get busy. When he's aide to Washington and they're crossing the Delaware River into a little town on a snowy overnight called Trenton, is he keeping a diary? Of course not. But for some of the quieter times, like the New York campaign, he did. And one of the things he mentions is, and you and I were talking about this, the George Washington potential plot by British and Tories for capturing or killing potentially General Washington and perhaps others like Israel Putnam. That was basically June and July of 76. And of course, it's the founding father, John Jay, who will help interrogate and expose the plot as an attorney and judge who's presiding over the trial of Thomas Hickey, who's basically as a Washington's lifeguard. For all of your watchers, they're probably familiar with the fact that Washington's lifeguard are basically the Secret Service for a military role in their uniforms for General Washington as commander in chief. And Thomas Hickey is involved in this plot along with Michael Lynch and several others from Washington's lifeguard. And they are from Connecticut. But then you have, of course, Dave Matthews, mayor of New York City, no relation to the band Dave Matthews, but you have Lee, Governor Tryon, the royal governor, and he's in his mega yacht. They're in either the East River or the North River, as the Hudson River was then called, and they are plotting this because the Patriots are occupying Manhattan, and so Tryon and Matthews are on this frigate-sized ship that's armed, but it's basically Tryon's flagship saying, okay, what are we going to do? What plot can we hatch? and it involved Hickey and so forth. And so to get back to answering your question, Samuel Webb as well as William Heath, the Major General from the Boston area, both write in their diaries on these dates, until we get to Benedict Arnold or since Benjamin Church a year earlier, this is the darkest plot, the most sinister thing that any of them had seen.
Now, yeah, it was a direct threat on Washington's life. And I believe Thomas Hickey was a deserted British regular, wasn't he?
That I've not heard before. I do know that because he was Irish born, he had immigrated to Connecticut at some point, and I was able to establish that he was extremely likely from Wethersfield because he had signed the account book of a cooper who made wood barrels,
Okay.
and that cooper was named Samuel Hamner, who just happened to be the owner of our house in Wethersfield, also like the one that we own here, built in 1765. When I looked at the account book and then I looked at documents from that era, 1770s, he is the only Thomas Hickey living in Connecticut at that point. So it would have to be the same Thomas Hickey who committed this treason. But I don't know anything about the British part, the defection.
I could be wrong on that point. I seem to recall that, but I could definitely be wrong. If he was living in the colonies, I mean, he may have been a regular for a time and left the service honorably. He may not have been a deserter.
Mm-hmm.
But I seem to remember he was a British soldier at one point. But yeah, no, I think your book does a wonderful job of bringing out the lives of these people in Connecticut, from the Connecticut establishment who become an important part of the revolution. And they combined touch on various parts of the war throughout the entire war, and all there at various important events and things like that. It is an interesting read.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have questions for our guest tonight? I want to open it up a little bit. Anybody has anything they want to talk about? Any questions about Connecticut and the war, or the Trumbolls, or any of that stuff?
I've got a question for you, Damien.
Yes.
Hi there. I have a couple in mind, but you've done a tremendous amount of research. Just curious where it took you to. You mentioned Philadelphia. Is the Connecticut Historical Society, did they have material? Were you looking at material no one's ever looked at in many years or ever? If you could talk a little bit more in depth about your research.
Sure. Great question. So thanks, David. So there were a few, in fact, David is alluding to something he had shed some light on for me, which was a small collection that was buried in boxes in a basement for years at the National Park Service Visitor Center, a collection in Morristown, New Jersey. So I was able to take advantage of looking at 10 previously untranscribed letters of Jedediah Huntington from there. I looked at untranscribed letters of Jabez and Faith Trumbull, Huntington, if you will, from the Connecticut State Library in Hartford, right across the street from the state capitol. And that allowed me to embellish or build on what had already been documented about Faith Trumbull through other scholarship by other women back in the 1980s who had researched on Faith Trumbull Huntington, as well as more recently. And yet I found these 6 letters that no one had ever transcribed that she had written to Jedediah, and also letters of Jabez Huntington writing to his dad at the behest of his mother, Faith. And then I was fortunate that there were a few letters that had not been transcribed that were buried in the archives at Valley Forge.
Huh.
And those were to supplement, say, those 3 or 5 letters, as well as the David Library's collection that moved from South Jersey to Philadelphia, as you know, the Pennsylvania Historical Society. I used some of their transcriptions and their letters during COVID. Now, thankfully, I was worried about the challenges of the pandemic and would it delay my research capabilities. And as the director of the Museum of American Finance, there were so many museums like yours that took this opportunity, made lemonade out of lemons, right? And said, let's start digitizing some of this and bring it online to a wider audience. And part of that was for scholars like me who were taking advantage of it as researchers. And so whether it was your museum or Yale or the Connecticut State Library or Connecticut Historical Society, which during the pandemic turned to calling themselves the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, all of you in the museum world were doing a wonderful job for us And so there was that synergy where we could help promote your museums, and you were able to help promote all of us as historians to get the word out and be able to dive deeper. I have to say, Jedediah Huntington's handwriting is not the easiest. It's not as easy to read as George Washington's or Alexander Hamilton's. But I persevered. As Winston Churchill once famously said at a college graduation speech, he said, "Never give up, never give up, never give up." And so I punched through and I persisted in reading Huntington's letters, and there were some others who were difficult to read. One of the most beautiful sets of letters to read, which mostly were transcribed anyway, but was his younger brother Ebenezer. I have a few documents of his, and they're a joy to look at. I mean, his I guess rounded curvilinear style of writing was just so beautiful. And then the most poignant, the most powerful moment, which I have a photograph of in my book, I have a self-portrait, a little selfie of me holding a letter that was written by the young Jabez at age 8. I mean, amazing how beautiful this kid could write at 8 years old. So thank you. There it is. Yeah. Thank you, Mike.
But, well, yeah, it's fascinating that you were able to physically visit a lot of these places during COVID, that, you were able to actually get in there and see some of these things during that time.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Davis, you have a question?
Not a question, but coincidentally, on the wall put over my head is a document signed by Samuel Huntington,
Nice.
October 10th, 1774, when he was a lowly justice of the peace. I don't know if that adds anything to your vast history, but it's there. The other thing, I might have to go through my collection, some pay orders that were signed by Jedediah. You're welcome to them. My wife would love you for helping clean out the drawer. So I'll look to see what I have. But anyway, I thought it was rather nice. You're talking about Samuel, and I have his nice document as Justice of the Peace. So he went on to better things.
I take it you're a collector of documents from that era?
I have collected some documents. I sold one I got, if you're familiar with the Abraham Hunt story, who entertained Colonel Raw on Christmas night, and historians for about 150 years said there was no evidence he sought the protection of the British.
Mm-hmm.
His treason papers fell into my hands in 94, and I've had quite a fun run with that. It's kind of fun. You never know where it's going to lead you.
That's right. That's right.
I've enjoyed writing like you have. So
Nice.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Well, I guess I could just add one more element, which is, as we look forward to 2026, I've been involved in a lot of the behind the scenes planning by different commissions and boards and other size groups. And what are they planning? How are they going to look at 2026 as the 250th of the American Revolution and declaring our independence rather in July of 76? And so folks were in the museum and public history world concerned about what is the reference or relevance to today. And so we've been doing this for years, of course. And so this is just a continuation of that and shedding light on previously underappreciated demographics. I think my book does that with Jabez as a child, Faith as a woman who was depressed and then unfortunately tragically took her own life. But the one I haven't mentioned yet is also, as the contemporary people would call them, people of color, Blacks and Native Americans who helped build the USS Confederacy, the Navy frigate. The interesting coincidence is that it was built just across the river from the modern day casino known as Mohegan Sun, right there on the Thames River. It's through the research of a colleague and myself, we were able to determine that the ship was built at Confederacy Cove, which is right next to the bridge that goes over the Thames River from Mohegan Sun side towards the Foxwoods side. And Foxwoods is a rival casino 10 minutes southeast of Mohegan Sun. They are the Manchatucket Pequots. What's interesting is that the ship was built between 1777 and 1779. I talk about this in the last chapter of my book. So it's a perfect way to begin wrapping up here this evening. And that is that these demographics, including members of the Mohegan and possibly Narragansett and Manchatucket tribes, were helping construct the ship. And then we definitely know that members of the Ashbow family, Samuel Ashbow had already died at Bunker Hill. He's the first Native American to die in the American Revolution, unless we go back and look at Crispus Attucks as biracial. But Ashbow is serving in a battle at Bunker Hill. And it's one of his brothers who will serve not only to help build the ship, but then serve as a sailor or Marine on the ship and die at sea, which, spoiler alert, takes place in my second book. But, that was a way when I went down to the Pennsylvania Historical Society that fateful day of March 13th, 2020. That's what I was trying to do there, was look for the records, the pay stubs, to prove, to demonstrate, illustrate that these Black and Native American labor had been indeed paid for their construction talents. And so that's a theme that the state of Connecticut, I'm sure New Jersey's doing something similar. I know New York and Massachusetts are all trying to, on the one hand, be patriotic and then to embellish or supplement that with recognizing the ethnic diversity of the United States and trying to explain it to a younger audience and a more diverse audience. What does July of 1776 mean to all of us?
Yeah, I think that is important. There certainly were a lot of contributions by all different groups, even if they weren't permitted to be in the leadership of our government positions at the time. They certainly did contribute in a critical way to the overall movement. And there were people from all walks of life who felt enough about the importance of making this change in government and establishing our independence to dedicate their lives and, to the extent they had, fortunes and sacred honor to this mission. So yeah, it's always a very interesting thing to take a look at, and I love the way that you've dug into some rabbit holes, as you say, that haven't been widely visited before. So it does make for a very interesting read.
Damien, this is Jim Keaton. First of all, thank you, and I'm going to order your book. But I kind of enjoyed the few minutes before your formal talk. Can you kind of elaborate on your opinion on Ken Burns and how where his opinion leans towards? Obviously, working PBS and all, but how do you think this new program is going to be on the American Revolution?
It's a good question. I really don't have a good answer because I haven't seen the pilot for it, or haven't been one of those scholars who's been privileged to be able to see preview showing. So I guess I could say that I'm really not sure what to expect, other than hopefully something that is as visually stimulating as what we all remember back in the day with the Civil War series. I think that would be the most similar series he's done. I'm a big baseball fan, so I remember the baseball series as well. And I also liked the Jazz and the National Park Service series. They're each a little different from each other. I mean, it'll be interesting. I guess he will have had his teams of researchers and such dive in to find the kind of the military or martial music that both the British, but also Hessian and other crown forces and the American Patriot and Loyalist forces would have used, so that we get some of the soundtrack in the background that we remember from the Civil War series and others. I would anticipate that through the reenacting world, that'll be performed as the soundtrack, and that'll expose this a wide array from music history. And then you have limited photography, of course. So, we only have a handful of veterans who made it into the age of photography, as the Museum of American Revolution illustrates on permanent display there in Philadelphia. So then what are you looking at? And of course, you're looking at people like the ones I talk about, John Trumbull, Ralph Earl, Gilbert Stuart, and so forth. And what are going to be those visual contributions, along with, of course, the maps. I mean, I would think we would anticipate there'll be some great ones with the British cartographer, is it Montresor, if I'm pronouncing him correctly? That map of New York is just incredible. So I would anticipate that some of the great collections at the Library of Congress and elsewhere would be used. What are you thinking? What can I turn the table and ask what you think you might anticipate from Ken Burns' series?
I think he'll be good. He's kind of like the James Mitchell of television. He cranks them out and he does excellent work. And yeah, I love the baseball one, especially, of course, the Civil War. But, it's just a different world now. I mean, as far as people, as far as being split with the political opinions, and they're going to take it one way or another with American Revolution. I just unbiased.
Yeah, and I would think you're raising an important point, and I had concerns about how the divisions, how the divide was going to possibly increase going into the 250th. Hopefully, it's an opportunity for some kind of effort towards cohesion, that all of us, despite our differences, could have a civil discourse, and hopefully that will come to fruition over the next several years. I think that's already begun, that people realize that violence is not always the answer, and that civil discourse is what John Locke and hopefully others like some of the other founding fathers realized, is kind of one of the, if you read between the lines, when you read Joseph Plum Martin, when you read some of the letters of the people in my book, like Jedediah Huntington and Ebenezer Huntington, and Michael and Troy and I were talking about this about 45 minutes ago. In 1779, there's such disillusionment, right, with Congress and so forth. The war has calmed down in the North. It's going to shift for British grand strategy to the South. But that disillusionment that we had, not only with Congress, but also even to some degree, the fault lines were already showing challenges operating in our alliance with France. And then you can take that forward to Washington and the farewell address that's written basically by Alexander Hamilton, beware of foreign entanglements abroad. So I think there's a lesson learned about, if you read between the lines, My Portraits of Patriots is a warning. So you want a revolution, huh? And you want to start this war? Are you going to be remembered? If you're Joseph Plum Martin of 1775, 50 years later in 1825, he says, Congress doesn't remember us. We paid with our lives. Those of us who are alive, we starved many times. We didn't have the right kind of medicine, of course. We were highly diseased. We lost more lives in the Patriot Army, Continental Army at Valley Forge than we did at any battles or campaigns like Saratoga or Yorktown. So what is Congress going to do for us? And it sounds like modern times. You don't have to be Benedict Arnold or Ebenezer Huntington. You could be Joseph Plum Martin or Jeremiah Freeman and say, where's Congress to help us? And it took, as you know, a president who had been a veteran at the Battle of Trenton and others, in President James Monroe, to say, folks, we need to have Congress do something about a pension for the soldiers. And so that's a cautionary tale, right? It's lessons learned. If you're going to take up arms, are you going to be remembered 50 years from now or even 25 years from now?
Yeah, I have to admit, I was actually able to interview Ken Burns earlier this week, and he also gave me a preview of his documentary. So I've seen all 6 episodes already.
Oh, nice.
It really is, I think, a great summary of the war, and it really does go through the war. It focuses on the experience of the war itself, as opposed to focusing on Congress and the political changes that were going on. Those are, of course, mentioned, but the focus really is on the war itself, and it does talk a lot about the contributions of Native Americans and African Americans to it. They follow several common people who have left a written record throughout the war and their experiences from the war. Of course, Joseph Plum Martin's in there as well. So yeah, he does do a lot of that. He does do a lot of panning across paintings because that's all they have, and he does make greater use of footage from Revolutionary War reenactments, which he hasn't done in a lot of his earlier documentaries, but he did something to get footage for this stuff. But the reenactments are not, you're usually not seeing faces. You're seeing, boots marching across a road, that sort of thing, just kind of an abstract shot to kind of fill in a visual for what they're talking about at the time, things like that. But yeah.
What about the music?
I'm trying to remember. I didn't pay a lot of attention to the music. I mean, there is some in it, but a lot of it too is historians just talking on a silent back screen too.
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I have to admit, I have to go back and rewatch them again to get a better appreciation for the music that they used. But there was some, yeah, but it's definitely worth watching. I think it does a really good summary of the war itself from beginning to end, and yeah, I think we'll all enjoy it.
And I'll admit that in addition to the two key events, the 250th of Bunker Hill and the creation of U.S. Army, Continental Army in June of 1775, I knew, as we all did for years in advance, that this was something in the works for Ken Burns and his team, that it would come out this fall. So I wanted to be able to make sure to ride that wave of success that he will have with it, just like the Hamilton musical or other Ken Burns series or other popular big name books. I wanted people to be able to have a wide bandwidth that they could choose from, including authors like myself.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more books, movies, documentaries, TV specials, all sorts of stuff about the American Revolution, especially next year. 2026 is the big year. It's the anniversary of independence, even if the war does go on for many years after that. So yeah, we're seeing a general uptick in just everything that's available to talk about this, and it's going to be an interesting time.
And just to look further on the horizon with my second book, if my first one cuts off at 1779, obviously the second one picks up in 79. Operations resume with the Confederacy. Okay, it is sailed out to sea. Where is it headed? Spoiler alert, not far from you, Philadelphia region. What is it going to do? Well, find out, but it involves John Jay and bobbing out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with the French on board, no less. And then in addition, it takes you all the way through not only John Trumbull's budding career as a painter, but the military operations that terminate with Jonathan Trumbull Jr. during the Siege of Yorktown campaign, keeping a diary, including his reflections on this opulent dinner that George and Martha host for the French and their entourage at Mount Vernon, just before they will, all march into the Yorktown region to set up their siege, and then visiting Comte de Grasse on the flagship of the French fleet. What does that pageantry and panoramic view look like? I thought Jonathan Trumbull did a nice job illustrating that in 1781 language. And then I take it all the way through, what is the legacy of John Trumbull and others, including one of the grandsons in the Huntington family, Daniel Huntington, who will become a prominent painter, not a first-tier name, but he's kind of the Ralph Earl of the 1870s, 80s, 90s. He paints Samuel Morse. He paints a woman who allegedly is aiming her musket in downtown New London after Benedict Arnold has raided and burned the military supplies and ships there. Her name is Abigail Hinman. That's at the Lyman Allen Museum here in southeastern Connecticut. He paints her. He paints two presidents of the United States, and he paints some of the first wives. And Daniel Huntington would have come to this house, General Jedediah Huntington's house, because his grandfather was Jedediah Huntington, and his other grandfather was a cousin, Benjamin Huntington. So he descended as a Huntington from both his mother's family and his father's family. They were distant cousins. They were like third cousins, his grandparents. So it's fascinating to see what the legacy would be with someone like Daniel Huntington, kind of picking up where John Trumbull left off in the middle of the 1800s. And then what does it mean now, in terms of historic preservation, these different houses, whether it's the Huntingtons or the Trumbulls, or how we remember Faith Trumbull, because she's in an unmarked grave up in Dedham, Mass. She's in a crypt, and it's described in very Halloween kind of language, especially for 1775. It's pretty interesting to read what Lieutenant Jabez Fitch has to say in his diary when he crawls into the crypt with a colleague of his, another young, curious officer. And they're like two curious Georges wondering what the crypt looks like that November 1775, and he describes it. Those are all these stories that I wanted to make sure that got out, and that we don't forget Faith Trumbull Huntington and others' contributions, just the way that you were saying Ken Burns has done with this series, now that you've been able to see it.
Your book, Portraits of Patriots, just came out a couple months ago. It is available for sale now. And of course, I'll put a link up in the show notes for anybody who's interested in it. But Damien Cregeau, I really appreciate you joining us on the American Revolution.
No, and I would love it. Thanks for having me on. I love it if people, when they buy through Amazon, if they eventually enjoy reading it, please leave a review for me on Amazon, or you can reach out to me directly for a signed copy that I can mail to you. So thank you again. I've been a big fan of your podcast and these roundtable video podcasts. So thank you, Mike, again for having me on and for this opportunity.
Thanks again for joining our discussion with Damien Cregeau, author of Portraits of Patriots, Colonel John Trumbull, and 5 fellow patriots from Connecticut in the American Revolution. The book is available on Amazon.com, and I've included links in my show notes and on the blog for this episode. If you would like to participate in future live events on the American Revolution, please make sure to join my mailing list or sign up even as a free member on Patreon to get advance notice of these events. Once again, thank you for joining the American Revolution podcast.